unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Tali Sharot, who is professor at UCL, University College London, in neuroscience, also occasionally at MIT, also the author of a bunch of books. Most recent book is co-authored with Cass Sunstein. It's called Look Again. I don't know, is it just one or two? Look Again, Look Again. The Power of Noticing. Yeah, what was always there. And your previous books include The Influential Mind, What the Brain Reveals About Our Power to Change Others, and The Optimism Bias, which came out, 12, 13 years ago. A tour of the irrationally positive brain. Welcome, Tali.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I think all of these books cover similar topics and material, although they're bursting at the seams with insights and coverage of not only research that you've done, but research of others in neuroscience, social sciences, behavioral economics, and so forth. And the themes, including adaptation or habituation, which is the topic of the most recent book, but also optimism and overconfidence, and also confirmation bias and how to overcome it. These are themes which I've always been interested in. And while social scientists, neuroscientists have studied them and they've looked at the consequences and the proximate causes, I think you also spend some time thinking about the adaptiveness or lack of adaptiveness, right, of these different things, which I guess some people would call biases. Others would call sort of cognitive architecture, cognitive defects, and so forth. And I guess before we dig into any of them individually, I guess, do you think that we spend more time or too much time explaining or describing and not enough time sort of evaluating? I mean, because not only are you trying to explain, but you're also trying to figure out, are these things good or bad? And I know behavioral economists always like to point out the badness of them, but you, I think, are digging into the biological adaptive reasons for why we have this particular architecture.
I don't know if we, and I'm not sure who we are, spend too much time on one or the other, but I think all of these things are important, right? First, we need to identify these, whatever you call them. Some of them are biases, some of them are little tricks that our brain plays on us, or just the mechanisms by which we perceive information, make decisions, and so on. So we need that descriptive. And then, as you say, we kind of need to figure out what's good about this way by which we interact with the world and what may be less good about it. And also, for me, it's really interesting, what are the underlying mechanisms, both the biological mechanisms and sometimes the cognitive mechanisms as well. And I think all of these aspects are also interesting for the layperson and important for, different aspects, from business to education, policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we can start with hedonic adaptation or hedonic forecasting. And I think economists are always concerned about this because when they're thinking about maximizing utility, they don't know quite what they should be thinking about when they think about utility, right? Prospective utility, retrospective utility, contemporaneous utility. And I think a lot of people are surprised at the fact that these things aren't all in alignment, right? So maybe start off by asking, why is it that we do have this hedonic adaptation, and why is it that we're so bad at forecasting it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so hedonic adaptation is our tendency to react emotionally less and less to things that are constant, that they've always been there, or they're very frequent. So one example is, maybe let's just take a simple example. Maybe you have a comfortable home and a nice view outside your window, or maybe you bought a new car. And so when you just move into your home or get that car, you have a strong emotional reaction, right? It makes you happy. These are material things, but the same thing is true for maybe relationship, a new and your romantic relationship. So we have these strong feelings at first, but then because of things have always been there, then we start to habituate, meaning that we notice them less and we react to them less and less over time. So I gave a few examples of the good stuff. So that means we have less joy from those things that have been there for a long time, despite the fact that they might be very good. But it's true for the negative things, right? So there might be some negative events in our life, and there's data on this, on divorce, becoming unemployed, losing a limb or so on. And at first there's a strong emotional reaction, which kind of subsides over time, and we all experience this, right? So that is emotional habituation. So despite the fact that we experience this often, I don't think that people kind of are very conscious of this. I mean, if you ask them about it and describe it, then yes. Although you can also think about some instances where they won't quite realize that it's happening. But I think when we try to predict, and there's studies show that when we try to predict how something will make us feel, we don't take that into account to the extent that it does. And so, for example, there's the well-known bias, impact bias, that Daniel Gilbert, I think, is the first one to show, which is when you think about something happening, let's say a divorce, you think you're going to be feeling really bad about it, but you think you're going to continue feeling really bad for a long time, so you don't take into account the effect of habituation. But it's also true for just simple things in life. So there's some counterintuitive examples. One example that we have in our book is about music. So if you ask people, would you rather listen to a song from beginning to end, no interruptions, or would you rather listen to a song with interruptions? So every 30 seconds, we're going to stop you for 20 seconds, and again 30 seconds, stop you for 20 seconds. 99% of people say, I want to listen to the song beginning to end, no interruptions. It's intuitive, right? But when they actually did the experiment and they had one group listening to the song continuously and the other group listening to the song with interruptions, they actually found that those that had interruptions enjoyed the song more overall. And they were willing to pay double to listen to the band in concert. And the interpretation that they give is that, well, when you listen to the song at the beginning, it's a song that you like, the joy is really high, but then the joy starts dwindling over time. It's still high towards the end, but not as high as it was at the beginning. But then if I put in a little break, there's dishabituation. And so when the music comes on again, your joy bounces back up, maybe not quite to the point that it was before, but quite high. It starts going down. There's a break, dishabituation, jumps back up. So overall, you enjoy the song more if you listen to it with breaks, which of course is counterintuitive. And I realize that people are not going to do that. They're not going to listen to a song and put in breaks. But it's a good kind of, you can take it as an example for other things. For example, they did the same with massages, and they found that people enjoy a massage more with breaks than continuously. That is something that maybe is something that you could do. Another example is vacations. I did a little research with a big tourism company that wanted to know when people are happiest on vacation. And when I asked people this question, they usually answer something that's quite right. Like they don't get the exact like point of peak of happiness of vacation, but they do say something like the first day, and the answer is 43 hours in. So people do have the intuition that they're happiest on vacation after a little bit of time towards the beginning, which is what the tourism company found. 43 hours in is the peak of happiness. And then after that, it starts dwindling. Again, joy is still high 8 days in, 7 days in, 6 days in, but not as high as it is on day 2 because of habituation. You get to the resort at first, the view of the ocean is so it's really salient and you're kind of like taking it in. And then day 2, a little bit less, day 3, a little bit, and so on. So 43 hours kind of gives you the time to unpack and to focus on fun. And from that point on, it starts going down. So you could imagine that you would want more of those peaks, more of those 43 hours in. So more of those like small, short vacations, but frequent rather than a very long one. And I think when you ask people, would you enjoy a long vacation more than a short one or a couple of short ones, maybe they won't give you the correct answer. It's just we don't really think about these little kind of tricks that our brain plays on us when we try to forecast these things.
So this is sort of a form of hedonic engineering, right? Where you make yourself happier by adjusting the inputs to your happiness. And presumably the flip side here would be that when you have a negative experience, you want to do it continuously. Like you don't want to break it up, right?
Right, exactly. So we say break up the good, but swallow the bad whole. And the same people who did the experiment with the music, they also did an experiment with a noise that was quite annoying. So think something like a Hoover noise, like, cleaning noise kind of thing. And they asked people, would you rather listen to this annoying noise for, a few minutes, no breaks, or would you rather have breaks in between? And people said, I want breaks, right? I want a break from this annoying noise. But again, when they did the experiment, they found that people who listened to the annoying Hoover type noise from beginning to end, no interruptions, they actually suffered less, because in this case, habituation is your friend, right? It causes the negative feelings to go down over time. So overall you suffer less. But if I break up the negative experiences, you dishabituate from the noise. And when it comes back in, the suffering goes back up, right? And it starts going down, break, goes back up. So overall suffering is greater. So we want to kind of, whatever it is, it's household chores, it's admin work, grading papers, just get it over and done with in one go if possible.
Now this flows from the general cognitive architecture where we tend to notice things that are new and different, right? And things that remain the same tend to recede into the background. Now, is that purely about managing cognitive load, right? I mean, if you think about a compression algorithm, if you're recording a movie, right, each frame, you're going to try to minimize the amount of data by just emphasizing what's changed from frame to frame. I mean, is that what's going on with the dopamine system? We're focusing on just kind of what's new, what's novel?
So we talked about the emotional impact of this. And as you say, part of the reason for emotional habituation is sensory adaptation or sensory habituation, which means that we just perceive things that are constant, less and less over time. Our brain just stops responding. And it is a fundamental feature of our brain. Every system in our brain does it. And it's true for every species. So it's not just humans, right? Bees, flies, everyone. And when you see a phenomena that is so general, there is probably an adaptive function to it. And just to kind of describe it, just that people get a sense of what sensory adaptation is or habituation is. And I talk about these two words interchangeably. So an easy example is you walk into a room, it's full of smoke. At first, the smoke is very salient, but studies show that within 20 minutes, you cannot smell the smoke any longer. The olfactory neurons in your brain have stopped responding. That's true for always for olfaction. When you have a new kind of smell, it's perfume, it's coffee, it's, baked good, your neurons kind of fire. But then if you're not changing your environment, it stays the same, they just quiet down, just stop responding as long as you're alive and everything is well, because the information has been processed. It doesn't seem to need more of a response, so they quiet down. So now they have resources to respond to the next things that is coming your way. And so that is, I think, the adaptive function of that, right? Just to keep the resources, because the next thing that comes your way may kill you. So you need to be prepared.
But I think you point out that it's not just that we notice change when it happens, but we can change the likelihood that we'll notice new things by reorienting our perspective, right? Sort of, stepping away and then returning, and we may see things that we didn't see before, right?
Right. Or see the old things that we can't see any longer. right? And we have a visual example of this in the book, in the inside cover of the book. There are blurbs of different colors, yellow, green, blue, red, and a little fixation at the center. And if you fixate your eyes at the center and you don't move your eyes at all, the colors suddenly become gray. You don't see the colors anymore. And if you're really good at it and you really don't move your eyes, it will actually become white. But then, so this is habituation, right? Your neurons in your visual cortex, every neuron is getting the exact same input as long as you're not moving your eyes. And so after a while, it just stops responding. But the moment you move your eyes from the fixation point, the colors come in again. Because now different neurons are getting different inputs, you've dishabituated. So just as we can dishabituate to things like vision or smell, we can also dishabituate to the more kind of complex things in our life, so we can be able to notice them again and so feel again. And I think people have probably this intuition that if you go away for a while, maybe it's a business trip, or you go away for a week or so and then you come back. When you come back home, suddenly you appreciate things more and you can see them more. Suddenly the comfortable, aspects of your home, maybe it's like a comfortable bed or, your family, you have more of a reaction and you notice more. And that's because you took yourself away from that environment. Now you come back. So now you can observe and you can see again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. While I was reading this book, I was also working on a crossword puzzle. And when I got to an impasse, I said, okay, I'm going to step up and walk around, go do something else. And then when I came back, I solved the rest of the puzzle. And so, I mean, people can take on fresh perspectives, presumably from a stationary position. I mean, as a mental exercise, you can assume different perspectives through imagination, right?
Yeah. So we talked before about kind of taking yourself out. So you're going away for a week and you're coming back. But you can try to do this via imagination and it will have some of an effect as well. So for example, Laurie Santos, professor at Yale, she talks about how she doesn't use the word dishabituation, but it's a similar thing. I think she doesn't use it, but it's a similar thing where if you close your eyes and now you try to imagine your life without your comfortable home or your interesting job or your loving relationship or whatever it is that you have good in your life, and you try to kind of close your eyes and imagine you don't have that, then when you open your eyes again, right, then kind of there's again kind of this feeling of, oh, now, when you think about it, it's really kind of scary to kind of imagine it. And then you open your eyes and then you get a little bit of the same dishabituation by just using your imagination. But there's another thing that you mentioned, which is that you were trying to solve a crossword puzzle and then, you couldn't find the solution and then you just stepped away, went for a walk, whatever you did, and came back, and then the solution came to you. And there's actually studies showing that we're able to find solutions and creative solutions more so if we change our immediate environment. Mm-hmm. So sitting in the office for a while, but then stepping out, going for a walk, or if you are at a walk, then you come back into your office or go sit in a coffee shop, go sit in the kitchen. So just these immediate changes of your environment, what the study shows is that the creative solutions are enhanced every time you make a change on average. Now, this boost lasts on average for 6 minutes. However, those 6 minutes could be, the important minutes. And the speculation is that this is because you're changing your environment. So now you're getting different input, right? Because I'm seeing everything the same and I'm in the same physical position. My brain doesn't really have to respond to things. It's more of maybe on a quiet mode, I would say, but then I'm changing. So now it's taking in information, and that process perhaps leads to different thoughts, retrieval of different pieces of knowledge that may be important for the problem that you're trying to solve. I feel like I definitely had experiences like this, and I'm sure most of our listeners do, when I try to kind of recall those times when I had an idea that ended up being really, really important for, my research. Usually I can remember those instances, and they would never me sitting at my computer just working and trying to solve the problem, right? It was always one example, for example, I was in my office trying to solve a problem, couldn't solve the problem, decided to go to the gym, left the office, started walking, and within those 6 minutes, that's when I found, like, I came up with a solution, despite the fact that I don't think I consciously was thinking of it, right? You kind of need to have the knowledge inside your head and then go do something else. And then this kind of change can enhance the likelihood of coming up with a new answer, perhaps, that you didn't before.
Yeah, and you talked a bit about how if you want to foster creativity in the workplace, you can make some manipulations, right, to the work environment. I mean, I guess this is kind of the Hawthorne effect, right? The mythical Hawthorne effect, where you can just change things that might even have nothing to do with the problem that you're trying to solve, and this somehow triggers some aspect of curiosity that people wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, so this is what the studies show. And sometimes, the changes that you make, you think they're unrelated, but they can suddenly cause you to recall something, right? But I think also, like, companies and governments do this, where they let people rotate in different departments. In academia, we do this by going on sabbaticals, right? Students may go to another lab for a few months. Mm-hmm. So, and every time we make this change, that allows you, first of all, to see how things are different, to learn new things, right? But then when you come back to your home department or wherever it is, you then are you're able to see things differently, right? Because now you've learned something and you're coming back and you haven't been there for a while. So now you'll be able to see both the bad things, which you kind of got accustomed to and you got used to, and so you weren't trying to change, but now they may be quite salient because, well, in this place they did it differently and, they solved this problem. And so now you can see that better, but also the good things. Maybe there were good things that you just got accustomed to, and you didn't appreciate enough. So
some random reshuffling of the deck chairs might actually create some kind of improvement.
Yeah, for a while.
Uh-huh. But I think you also highlight that people may not be taking enough initiative to make changes in their lives, whether it means switching jobs or moving to different neighborhoods, because they maybe anticipate that it's going to be more difficult than it actually is. I mean, you talked about how people will oftentimes quit their jobs in the first months. We know that people commit suicide, right? Usually in the first week after they get sent to jail, right? At a much higher rate because they haven't yet adapted. But how do we reconcile that with the optimism bias, right, that you talk about in the other book?
Okay. So the optimism bias is our tendency to expect to encounter positive events more so on average than we do, and underestimate our likelihood of experiencing negative events in our life. So underestimating our likelihood of going to prison, getting a divorce, being in an accident, and so on. It is not necessarily how we will react to those events. So it's not that I think if I get divorced, then I won't feel bad. It's mostly, at least in my studies, it's about what is the likelihood of the event. It's actually, in fact, saying, oh, this event is so terrible, but I'm not going to have that happen to me. Right. So if you think about once it does happen to you, so you do go to prison, which in fact, likelihood of going to prison is low on average for the average individual. But let's say you are a criminal. And so for you, the likelihood is higher, but you think you're going to get away with it. You don't, you go to prison. It's not necessarily that you will feel less bad once you're there, right? Because you're optimistic. You may be optimistic about getting out of there, but it's not that the optimism doesn't suggest that people never feel bad when negative events happen to them. So I don't think that these are super conflicting. But what people do underestimate is how they will adapt to really terrible things. Because most people, there are exceptions and actually interesting ones, which we can mention, but most people do bounce back relatively. Sometimes it takes years, right? I mean, the average for divorce, I think it was a few years until you bounce back, right? So it does take time, but people do bounce back from really terrible events. However, people with mental health problems, especially depression, they tend to bounce back much slower than individuals with no history of depression. So there are individual differences. This was, for example, shown by a professor at University of Miami, Aaron Heller. He asked students who just got results of really important exams how they were feeling, and he continued to ask them how they were feeling every 45 minutes for the rest of the day. And he found that people who got bad grades, they failed, they felt bad. It didn't matter if they had depression, a history of depression, or no depression, everyone felt bad. But the difference was how fast they bounced back, right? People without a history of depression, after a while, within that same day, they bounced back to their previous level of well-being. While people with depression, it just took them much longer. Probably because they were ruminating over and over about this negative event, which caused them a low mood and hard time to get on with other things in their life. And as you say, when things happen to us, it could be even something good. We started a new job and this all very exciting, but now you have to get used to all this, new colleagues, new rules, new lunch options. It's hard, right? Change is always hard. It is a status quo that is the least effortful. And a change would almost always would be effortful. A change is also scary because the outcome is uncertain. If we continue with the status quo, we kind of know what's going to happen because we've done that so many times. But if we make a change, it could be good, it could be bad. And people are averse to uncertainty. And so that's one of the reasons why people are less likely to make a change than they really should.
I think that the optimism bias is a bit of a mystery, right, from an evolutionary perspective, because we can see all the ways in which this bias can lead to disaster, right? And you talk about some of them, and yet it seems to be pervasive. So what is the adaptive reason for our failure to calibrate our predictions about the future?
So the old way to answer your question was to think about what is the adaptiveness of optimism bias. And so people say, Daniel Dennett, who passed away recently, he said that it's a design feature because it enhances motivation, right? If I think I'm going to succeed, I'm more likely to put in effort and therefore more likely to succeed. I have a company, I think it's going to succeed, I am more likely to put in effort, right? If I think like, oh, it's never going to work, I'm never going to get a promotion, I'm never going to get that grant, I don't try, right? I'm never going to find love, then there's no reason to get out of bed at all. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in both ways, right? If I think it's negative expectations, less likely to go ahead and try things and therefore not succeed. If I think I'm going to succeed, I'm more likely to put in the effort and more likely to succeed. It also is related to well-being and happiness, because if I expect the future to be bright, I feel better, so I'm less depressed, good for my physical health as well, right? Less stress and so on. So that's kind of how people used to answer this question. And then there were another kind of thought process, which is, well, that's true in certain environments, right? Perhaps in a relatively safe environment like you and I are in today, then yes, there is this kind of advantage of motivation. It also enhances exploration, right? That's good because maybe I'll find some optimal things that I don't see in my immediate environment, and enhances physical and mental health. And but in environments rife with threat, then there are obviously all these potential negative outcomes. I may take too much risk, not go to medical screenings when I should, not put a helmet on when I cycle. So those are the negatives to it. And if the environment is really dangerous, there's lions coming your way, it's not a great idea to underestimate their likelihood. So that was the other kind of thought process. And then what we then thought, well, maybe the optimism bias is not something that is set in stone. Maybe it is something that you could see in certain environments when you're safe. But then when you go into another environment, let's say a dangerous environment, then perhaps there's some kind of biological, physiological response that changes the way that you process information and make you less likely to have an optimism bias. So that is to say, now where we're relatively safe, what we found is that one of the reasons you have optimism bias is you're more likely to take in the unexpected good news than the bad news. So if I tell you 2 million people are going to listen to this podcast, you may be more likely to take it in and revise your estimate. But if I say 0, you might say, she doesn't know what she's talking about, and not take in my information on which this is based on, right? So because you're more likely to take in the good news and bad news, that creates optimism bias. But what and we found that in many, 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 many experiments. But then what we found is that if I put you in a dangerous environment, it goes away. So if I put you under stress, then you start focusing on the negative information. You update your beliefs more about negative. So I would tell you, I have data that says no one's going to listen to this podcast. If you're under stress, you're more likely to believe me. Update your response, less likely to believe that my data about 2 million people listening. And then therefore, under these environments, you're less likely to have an optimism bias, which could be adaptive. So in other words, what's adaptive is not the optimism bias. What's adaptive is that we have potentially a mechanism in place that can switch our optimism bias on and off based on the environment that you are in an adaptive manner.
Right. I found interesting the relationship between optimism bias and discount rates, right? So, I teach behavioral finance, and so we focus a lot on hyperbolic discounting, but this may just be measuring one's beliefs about the predictability of the world, right?
Yeah. So there's, the famous marshmallow experiment where kids are told, if you don't eat this marshmallow, when I come back, I'll give you 2 and you can eat 2, right? And what they found was that some kids would eat the marshmallow and therefore not get the other one. But some kids will wait patiently to get the other marshmallow. And the interpretation of that finding was it is self-control, right? And they found that those kids who don't eat the marshmallow, who they interpret as having self-control, are the ones who later on in life are more successful professionally, personally, and so on. And you could say to some extent, they're discounting the future, right? I'm eating the marshmallow now, and the punishment is I'm not going to get the other one in the future, but the now is more important than the future. But it is possible and likely that those kids that eat the marshmallow now are the ones who are not optimistic about me coming back and giving you the second marshmallow. Perhaps they are living in an environment that's less reliable, less certain, they can't trust people. And that's why they eat the first marshmallow, and they're less optimistic. And there's a lot of data showing that people who are less optimistic are also less likely to be successful. So all of these things are very much related, right? If I think I'm going to die tomorrow, well, I'll consume everything now. But on the other hand, also, if I think that I will be very successful in the future, that's actually another reason to eat everything now, right? Because I'll be fine in the future.
When I talk about optimism bias with my students and audiences, I mean, a lot of people will say this is just an artifact of 20th and 21st century America, right? It's the epicenter of optimism and overconfidence. I mean, what evidence do we have that this is pervasive across time and culture?
Yeah, there are many studies showing this in different cultures, in the Western world, in the non-Western world. But most importantly, I think we have evidence showing this in non-human animals. And the diversity of species in which the optimism bias has been shown is kind of incredible. Everything from bees and horses and pigs, birds. And there are kind of many ways to show it, but mostly it goes something like this. If I explain the bird experiment, it is the bird is taught that if it hears a long auditory tone, ooh, like that, it should press a lever on the right side. And if it does that, it gets an immediate reward. So food immediately, which is like great. The bird is super happy. But if it hears a short auditory tone, like that, it should press the lever on the left side. If it does that, it does get a reward, but after a long delay. The bird is not happy. It doesn't like to wait for its food. Okay, now comes the test. The test is a tone that's between the very, very long tone and the short tone, a medium tone, right? And the bird still has to get it right. If the medium is closer to the long, it should press the right. If it's closer to the short, it could get the left. If it doesn't get it right, it's not going to get any food. So it's motivated to be as correct as possible. But what we see is that the bird will press the right lever, suggesting that it thinks this is a long tone that will get it the immediate reward, even when the tone is much closer to the short, right? So it is optimistically biased in interpreting the cues. And the interpretation of the bird is, this cue is telling me something good. So I need to do this. I need to press the right lever to get this immediate reward. And the similar things have been shown in different kind of ways in all these different animals. But interestingly, and going back to our other point, only when the animals are housed in nice big cages with plenty of water and toys. If the animal is stressed in a small cage without constant water and no toys, then it doesn't show this optimism bias. In fact, sometimes it will show the reverse bias. So if the animals have it, that suggests, it goes beyond Americans in modern age.
Well, I think a lot of people would observe contemporary America and be surprised if you claimed there was an optimism bias, right? I mean, it seems like politicians and the news media capitalize on fear and anxiety, right? And you highlight that there is a difference between the optimism about our own individual lives and potential pessimism about the external world. Well, how are these things related?
Yeah, so we call that private optimism and public despair. And in surveys again and again, what we see is that people are optimistic about their own future, the future of their family, the future of their kids, but they're not optimistic about the world at large. And in fact, they are somewhat pessimistic about global issues, about the abilities of the leaders. And let me give you a few examples. Let's take an AI. So people say AI will take more jobs than it will create. 75% of people say that, so 3 out of 4, but only 1 out of 4, 25% say their job is at risk. Out of every 4 people, 3 say that they're very optimistic about the future of their family. Again, 75%, but only 30% say that the next generation will be doing better than the current one. I mean, it's on and on. In the UK, the local NHS, which is where people get their medical treatments, and they say, oh, the NHS is terrible, but my local one is really good. So there's this kind of disconnect between how we think about global and private issues, and perhaps one of the reason is a sense of control. We have a sense that we're in control over our own future, even more than we actually do, right? We have this is another bias. We think we have more control than we do, but because we think we have control over our own future, we believe we can steer the wheel in the right direction. We don't necessarily believe we have control over global issues, right? And so we're not necessarily optimistic about those issues.
Well, speaking of control, I mean, you talk a bit about the desire for control and how if you give people a sense of control, then they will not only be happier, but they'll be more inclined to pay attention to you, right?
It seems reasonable that they will be more likely to pay attention for you. I don't know about that specific piece of data, but we certainly, we and other people have shown that control in and of itself has value. So, when you usually think about control and choice, you think, well, people like control because it gets them the outcomes, right? So I want to be in control. I want to make my choices. I want to decide what I'm going to eat because then I can choose what I like, right? I want to be in control of the way I'm running my business because I think I'll be really good and I'll get the good outcomes. And that is true. But I think what we find is that people like control even regardless of the outcome. So even if they know that someone else will get them the exact same outcome that they would get themselves if they were in control, they still want the control and they're willing to pay for it. So even
That's why they want to manage
fact,
their own portfolio, right?
exactly, yeah, exactly. So even they're well aware and of the data showing that you might actually lose some money by making your own choices and control. People still want that. We've done experiments like this where they could have they make their own choices themselves about some financial outcome, or someone else makes a choice for them, and they can see and they can learn. I think we even explicitly tell them. I think we tell them the likelihood of the financial advisor getting it right in this experiment. And even though their likelihood is way higher than the person, they would still want to make their own choices. And by doing that, they would lose a certain amount. But what they gain, I think, is this hedonic reward of control.
And the evolutionary reason for that is that generally when you don't have control, that's not a good thing.
Right. So, I mean, the evolution reason is what I said before, which is normally by having control, you can make choices that are consistent with your preferences, right? And that's more likely to happen on average than someone else making choices for you. And so now control has evolved to have this hedonic response. Mm-hmm. And so even when the two things are dissociated, meaning in this case, control is not going to help me, well, they've already been associated through generations and maybe for our own experience. And so it's still something that we strive to have because often it will give us better outcomes, right?
You talk about some interesting research around information search, right? And people tend to search out positive information more than negative information. And this also seems to be in conflict with, we think about people doom scrolling, right? They're always going through their Facebook, looking for things to make them anxious. So how does this play out, this kind of pursuit of good news or good information, and not bad?
Yeah, so there are two things here that people may misunderstand. One is that people prefer good news over bad news, that they seek it out, all else being equal. Often, all else is not equal. So what has to be equal? Well, based on many, many, many studies, we suggested that there are three main motives for searching information. One is to instrumental utility, meaning I can use that information to gain better outcomes. So for example, I might want to know what's going on in the stock market if I'm about to put in money, because that will help me make better decisions, right? I want to know the prices of different flights if I'm about to buy one, because more information will save me some money. So people want information in order to make better decisions, to avoid harm and gain reward. That's instrumental utility. And they would want that information on average, even if it's bad news, right? So for example, if I know that I go to a medical screening, I might get bad news about maybe like having cancer, but that news can save me because then I can have preventative surgery. So on one hand, I don't want the bad news, and that may cause some people not to go and do the medical screening. On the other hand, there's reason to go because there's instrumental utility. The second reason for wanting information is reducing uncertainty, or in general, having a better understanding of the world around us. We call this kind of a cognitive utility. So people are driven to understand the world around them, or at least to have the perception and feeling that they understand. It's not so much about understanding. It's because we never know if we understand. There's no way for us really to know for sure what's true and what isn't true, but we have a drive to want to have this feeling that we understand. So that's a cognitive reward. And that is something that, again, that is something that you would want and you can get whether the news is good or bad. So knowing about what's going on in the world can make you feel really bad. And for some people, that would make you less likely to, look at the news. But on the other hand, it will enhance your understanding of the world. So that's a cognitive reward. So it's instrumental utility cognitive rewards, and then finally affective rewards. So that's our tendency to want good news over bad news. Now, all three things will drive your decisions of whether to seek information or not. So you will for sure seek a lot of negative information if the cognitive reward is high, instrumental utility is high, right? But all three things matter together. And there's ways for us to kind of tease them apart and show that all of them matter. So that's why, despite the fact that you feel like you go after bad news, you still have this tendency to want good news. The other thing is, what on the surface sounds like bad news can actually be good news to people in the sense that it elicits a positive feeling. So for example, if you are a Republican and you're searching for bad news about Democrats, that may actually make you feel good, and vice versa. You're a Democrat, you see like bad news about the Republican candidate, that may actually make you feel good. So bad news doesn't necessarily mean that results in a negative feeling for you. It can result in a positive feeling. And again, that's why it seems like people are attracted to bad news when in fact it's not really bad news. So all of this like celebrity breakups and, to some extent it can make people feel good because like, well, everyone has problems. So now I'm feeling better about my own life.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also talk about some of the pathologies of habituation, right? And you use the metaphor of the frog in the pot of boiling water, the apocryphal story of the frog. And you talk about things like lying and potentially corruption and oppression and how, people can get used to these things, right? Mm-hmm. And ultimately they don't see a problem with them if they are exposed to them for a long enough period of time.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, we know that the old story of if you put a frog in the water and then you heat it up a little bit in time until it's boiling, and they say the frog is not going to jump. We know that's not true. Studies show, yes, the frog will jump. But I think the metaphor here, regardless of whether the frog jumps or not, is what is of interest and has a truth in it when it comes to both animals and humans in many different aspects and contexts. And so really, I think the book, Look Again, which is about habituation, it actually started from a study that I published with people and members in my lab and other colleagues back in 2016, which was about dishonesty. And what we found is that people, when they are in a situation where they can be dishonest to gain something for themselves, in this case it was money, at the expense of someone else, they tend to feel bad about it, right? I mean, that's something well known from other studies. People say, I don't like to lie. It makes me feel bad. And so if we put them in this situation, they lied by a little bit. We could measure how much they lied in this game, and they would lie by just a few cents. But then we give them repeated opportunities to lie. We'd never said the word lie, but they could figure out if I lie, I get more money at the expense of another person. And what we found is the amount by which they lied became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over time. So lying escalated. And as they were doing this, we recorded their brain activity. And what we found at the beginning, there was strong activity in the amygdala when they lied. Despite the fact that they lied by a little bit, there was activity in the amygdala which suggests emotional arousal. Potentially, we think it's negative emotions for some other reasons that we have from our data. So people felt really bad. We could see the amygdala activity at the beginning, but then emotional habituation kicked in. And we already know what emotional habituation is. It is, I feel less and less and less in response to things that are frequent, right? So, and that includes my own behavior. So then I lie again and again. Every time I lie, there's emotional habituation. I feel less bad. Because I'm feeling less bad, there is nothing to carb my dishonesty, because what's carbing your dishonesty is this bad feeling. But if I take the bad feeling away, in this case, via emotional habituation, there's nothing stopping you from lying more and more and more. And so we could see that as people lied more and more and more and more, the amount by which they lied was larger, but their amygdala activity went down over time. And the amount by which the amygdala dropped from one point to the other predicted by how much they would lie the next time that they had an opportunity. Yeah.
So presumably if we went back and put the subjects in Milgram's famous experiment in the MRI machines, we would see something similar.
Yes, I think that's one of the interpretations that we have for the Milgram experiment, which is the way that he did the experiment was very specific, right? He started by asking people to shock the other person, but the shocks were just a little shock, right? The voltage was kind of small. And then over time, slowly, every time the person, the teacher, so to speak, the subject that was playing the teacher, had to shock the student, which they thought was the other subject, the voltage went higher and higher, but by little increments, gradually over time. And so it seems reasonable to believe that there's likely emotional habituation there, where at first you feel really bad about shocking someone else, but over time, the amount of negative feeling for every 1 unit of voltage goes down. So you're kind of feeling more free to shock them by more. It doesn't mean that they don't feel bad towards the end, but they feel less bad than they would have without emotional habituation. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you take emotional habituation out of the equation, imagine we have a brain, we have evolved not to have emotional habituation. It is hard for me to believe that people would do these things, right? That you would be able to see this effect of someone shocking the other person to such a high degree, or people acting so dishonest towards the end of the experiment.
Right. And when it comes to bad experience, you could be in a bad relationship, right? An abusive relationship, or you could be in a workplace that is full of bullies, right? Or, in a system of oppression. And, people can get used to anything, right? And in a way that's good, but in a way it's bad if you're trying to change that organization or that relationship or that society, right? And so I think I remember in de Tocqueville said that revolutions are most likely to happen when things are actually looking up, right? When there's a moment of potential reform, that's when the oppressors need to be right worried about a possible revolution. So, I mean, if you're an economist and all you care about is utility, then why would you want to stir things up, right? If the people who are in this oppressed situation have figured out a way to cope with it. But if you want to create some social change, you've got to somehow make them appreciate kind of how miserable they are, right? Should we be in the business of educating people about how miserable they really ought to feel, or should we just kind of let sleeping dogs lie? I mean, you can think about this on a personal level. If you have, if you know someone who's in a bad relationship or in a bad organization, it's always an ethical question. Do you say, hey, listen, you're really your workplace sounds terrible. Your relationship sounds terrible. And kind of, help them to see what they ought to be feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's different levels to this question. The first level is, if I feel fine about something, then maybe it's not a problem, right? You're saying, well, people have got accustomed to the abusive relationship, or maybe, to the government, they figured out how to live and they're not feeling unhappy. And we have data like this. You have data, in fact, showing that women in countries where inequality is greater are not less happy than women who are living in countries where inequality is lower. So, of course, not every country, but there's data like this. And so you can say, well, okay, I mean, if they're feeling fine, why should we do anything about it? So I think the first question is, what matters? Is it the fact that how happy we are? That is the ultimate gold standard of figuring out what is good and bad. I'm not sure that the answer is yes. I have to say that I used to think so, but I don't anymore. So I think if you think about it, and even if you think about your own life, people always think, oh, it's a puzzle. Why do we do things that don't make us happy, right? But we do things that don't make us happy all the time, because happiness is probably not the one thing that we're trying to maximize. And even, it's well known that you're not trying to maximize happiness for yourself alone. That's true. I mean, most of my time, I'm trying to maximize the happiness of my children beyond myself, even if it doesn't have me feeling happy. But But that's not just you're trying to maximize a whole bunch of things that we don't even know what they are and can't articulate. But it's probably something about like, well, we're trying to maximize having more meaningful and purposeful. And even perhaps we're trying to maximize freedom, even if freedom doesn't make us happy. So I think if you come from a viewpoint where that's not necessarily that, it's an important measure, but not the only measure for what is a good life, then you don't have this problem. Right. But then there's another answer, which is, well, even if they are potentially feeling happy and all you care about is happiness, it's still possible that there is a better situation, and that a change may cause you a decrease in happiness and well-being and utility, in the short run, but in the long run, either for yourself or for society, well-being will increase. So in an oppression situation or in countries with gender inequality, despite the fact that the women perhaps have adapted to the situation and don't necessarily have lower well-being than people in equal gender, perhaps if there is a change, and that will create a dip at the beginning for many reasons that we could talk about, but there'll be a dip, but maybe in the long term that will create a greater well-being for a society in large. So I think for those two reasons, we still want to make a change when we see situations when we think are not optimal for different reasons, which are not just happiness. It could be freedom, it could be equality, whatever we care about. There was one other point I was going to make.
Well, so I guess the idea is not to try and convince people that they are miserable or ought to be miserable, but to potentially educate them about how things could be potentially better. Right.
Yeah. The question is usually, and it's not an easy one to answer, is it possible to change? There are some things that obviously we cannot change, and it's better that we just habituate and adapt. Some losses of loved ones and so on, we can't get back. You lose, there are things that you can't change. In those kind of situations, it's better just to habituate and adapt. But there are many situations that we can change. And so for the situations that we can change, it is better that we wake up and notice and feel the pain, because without feeling the pain, we won't be driven to change.
Right. And so understanding the extent to which one can change how one feels is important. And you talk about phobias, right, and exposure therapy. And a lot of people do what is probably the inferior choice, right, by avoiding exposure to the thing, which is leading to the fears, right?
Yeah. Because again, that is usually the easier thing to do, depending on your fear. Sometimes not. Sometimes it takes so much effort to avoid the thing that you fear. But because when we fear something, we do everything that we can to avoid it, habituation doesn't kick in. I mean, habituation is only going to kick in if you experience the thing again and again and again, and then fear would go down over time, as long as there's not, hugely negative consequences. But because we're trying to avoid our fear, whether it is spiders or heights or closed spaces or whatever it is, then habituation never kicks in. And so, yeah, this is a well-known therapy mechanism, which is treatment, which is, expose yourself to the thing that you're afraid of in little steps, right? The gradual thing. So if it's a spider, maybe first it's a plastic spider, and then it's a spider, but it's far away, and then you get closer, and then you touch, and over days and days until the fear goes down. This is also kind of, it's used for paranoia. It's used for OCDs as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the book Influential Mind, you talk about carrots and sticks. And you talk about avoidance and attraction. And why is it that we get that wrong so often, right? When we're trying to influence people, why is it that we think that threats and sticks are going to do most of the work when rewards and attraction is really, and carrots tend to do the work more effectively?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So usually when we try to change behavior, also our own, but also other people, there's two ways that we usually gravitate to. either to tell people, if you don't do this, I'm going to punish you, or if you do this, I'll punish you, right? Or if you do this, I'll give you a reward, right? Or if you don't do this, I'll give you a reward. So there's a question often, what works best? Is it the punishment or is it a reward? And while I don't think there's really a one answer, there is some principles of the mind that will help us decide what is better in which situation. And one principle is the avoid approach principle. And so the avoid approach principle is this idea that in order to get the good stuff in life, whether it's chocolate cake or promotion or love, I usually have to act. I have to do something. So I'm thirsty. I don't have water here, but I have to move my hand and get the water in order to drink, right? Act to reward. But to avoid the negative stuff in life, whether it's deep waters, untrustworthy people, or poison, I usually need to stay away. Not always, but often, like the best reaction is just to not do anything, not to act. And so our brain has evolved in this kind of environment where when we expect a reward, there's a go signal deep in our brain, in our midbrain. It goes all the way to our frontal lobes, and it makes action more likely. And so when we expect something bad to happen, a punishment, there's a no-go signal deep in our brain, our midbrain, goes all the way via the center of our brain to our motor cortex, and it inhibits action. So we're less likely to act. And of course, we're sophisticated creatures. We can overcome this, right? We can overcome and act, but our initial response is actually to freeze, not to run. And so we have studies, and many other people have studies showing that if people expect a reward, they act faster. So for a really simple experiment that my colleagues have done, where we told people, if you press a button, you get $1. In another condition, we told them, if you press a button, you avoid losing $1. Mm-hmm. They were much quicker to press a button to get the $1 than to avoid losing the $1. But if they had to do is not press the button, there was less mistakes about not pressing the button to avoid losing than not pressing the button to get the $1, right? Because there's this kind of connection in our mind between actions and reward and inaction and punishment. And so that suggests if you want people to act, perhaps on average, it's better to highlight the rewards. If you want your kids to organize a room, perhaps that's the time to say, oh, you're going to find your favorite toy at the below the pile. But if you want them not to eat the chocolate cookie, you might say, well, if you eat the chocolate cookie, then, there's going to be this punishment. So not to act, you might want a punishment, and to act, you might want a reward. But there's another thing to think about, that if you kind of threaten people, well, that has a negative impact on their well-being. So that's also something to consider when you use threats to get people to act.
So if you're trying to prevent an organization from reckless risk-taking, or if you're trying to reduce the probability of a crash or an explosion or a hacking event, then you want to reward them for taking precautions, and you want to essentially use reminders of bad things when you're trying to get them to not do stuff. Is that how you would phrase your incentive schemes?
Yeah. And I think it seems, well, I don't know. And you asked before about why is it that we kind of tend to gravitate towards a punishment, like, oh, this terrible thing is going to happen if you don't do it. I think that our mind does move forward really quickly, right? I mean, that's what we always project the future. That's what our brain does all the time. So we can see that, if someone does this, then we can see the negative impact immediately. And so that's what we then explain to people. That's our intuition, and the automatic thing that we tend to do, just because our brain's already jumping to the negative consequence. But you can reframe your message. You can just take a step back. It's not super easy, but if you think about it enough, in a certain percent of cases, you can actually stop yourself and reframe the message. So for example, instead of saying, if you take route A, you will lose time and money, you might say, if you take route B, you will gain time and money, right? Rephrasing it to highlight the positive consequences of your actions, rather than saying, oh, this action would lead to the negative. So what it is that we want to do in order to get to the good outcome.
Well, all three books are full of fascinating observations and also a lot of interesting guidance and advice for improving your life and persuading others. I think the metaphor that I have immediately started using that I stole from you is this one about visual flight rules versus instrument flight rules, and how it's important to know when you need to switch from one to the other. And hopefully that's a lesson that all of us will take away from all three books. Tali, thank you so much for joining me. Latest book is called Look Again. And the other books are Optimism Bias and The Influential Mind. Check them all out. Thanks again.
Thank you.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.